Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life Telos' First Principle. Today I want to explore something that sits right at the intersection of biology, psychology, culture, and what I call life telos, the masculine-feminine polarity, and what happens when we try to erase or deny it. We live in a time when gender has become one of the most confusing, emotionally loaded, and ideologically captured topics in public life. Some people want to dissolve the categories altogether. Others want to return to rigid traditional gender roles. I don't think either of those paths provide a way forward at this point. We can't return to a world where men and women are forced into rigid prescriptions. But we also can't pretend biology, evolution, and human development are infinitely flexible or irrelevant. Let's start with a biological fact that we're sexually dimorphic species. Across all of evolutionary history, humans have existed as male and female. That's not a social invention. Sexual reproduction requires two complementary biological systems. Mixing genes has enormous adaptive advantages, and over time, males and females evolved hormonal, neurological, and behavioral differences that supported survival, mating, child-rearing, bonding, and even social organization. Even if you strip away culture entirely, which you can't, the basic biological differentiation remains, and it exists for a reason. From those biological roots, cultures developed norms and what we now call the masculine and the feminine. I'm not talking about pink and blue or high heels and football. When I say masculine and feminine, I mean complementary evolutionary tendencies. In shorthand, masculine tends toward protection, risk-taking, provision, boundaries, and initiative. Feminine tends toward nurturance, attunement, bonding, containment, and care. We could think of them in pairs. Protection on the one hand, and nurturance on the other. The former guards against external threats, and the latter sustains internal well-being. We can consider risk-taking / agency and attunement / sensitivity. The former pushes into the unknown, and the latter reads the signals around them, pick up on others' needs, or provisioning / resource getting and bonding / resource sharing. The former acquires and builds, and the latter forms attachments and distributes. Or the pairing of boundary setting and emotional holding. The former sets limits and standards, and the latter is emotionally holding within those limits. Or the pairing of initiative and direction and care and stabilization. The former is goal-directed and has forward drive, and the latter tends to stabilizing the relational system as it is and keep things well within it. These patterns aren't just cultural habits. They're rooted in our biology. Both sexes have testosterone and oxytocin, but not in equal measure. On average, men have far higher levels of testosterone, which fuels assertiveness, initiative, risk-taking, and protectiveness. Women typically have higher baseline levels of oxytocin, which supports bonding, attunement, nurturance, and social cohesion. These hormonal biases don't determine anyone's personality, but they do tilt the nervous system toward different adaptive behaviors. The point isn't that men can't nurture or women can't initiate. It's that the biological scaffolding for these tendencies is real, and it evolved in service to life. These are polarities, two halves of a life-serving system. Individuals can express both, but societies suffer when either pole is shamed or erased. These aren't random stereotypes. They're expressions of strategies that improved the chances of children surviving, groups stabilizing, and communities flourishing. Over thousands of years, different cultures translated these patterns into particular roles, expectations, and social norms. These can be different and are different on the surface, but they arise from the same deeper biological foundation. And yeah, some of those roles have become rigid, unjust, or even suffocating. But underneath this, there's a valid pattern, a polarity that has served life. We can see this most clearly in child development. Infants and children aren't raised by theories, identities, policies, or ideas alone. They're raised best by actual bodies with sexed biology and an embodied presence. When we try to substitute theory for that, dissociated from sexed biology, we sow confusion that interferes with attachment and development. Decades of attachment research in parent-infant studies show that embodied caregiving patterns, typically maternal attunement and containment and paternal rough-and-tumble play and boundary setting, shape secure development. And the hormonal scaffolding, higher average testosterone in males and higher baseline oxytocin in females, supports those functions. The way mothers and fathers typically interact with babies and children is different, and those differences matter. There's a reason rough and tumble play, boundary setting, and challenge are more often expressed by fathers, and attunement, emotional regulation, and containment are more often expressed by mothers. That doesn't mean that every man or woman fits the pattern, but the pattern exists, and children benefit from both poles. Those same poles don't just serve child rearing, they serve the wider social group. A culture without nurturance, empathy, and stabilizing care will fracture. A culture without protection, risk-taking, and boundary-making will be invaded, exploited, or dissolved from within. Healthy societies find ways to express both energies. They don't require every individual to embody them in the same proportions, but they do rely on the polarity remaining intact at the species level. And so where are we now? We're in a moment where two things are happening at once. On the one hand, many people, quite understandably, want freedom from rigid prescriptive gender roles. They don't want their life determined by stereotypes or biological essentialism. And our culture has rightly evolved to accommodate a variety of gendered expressions. At the same time, I believe there has been a profound misunderstanding about why gendered roles even exist. They're described in sophisticated academic language as merely the imposition of cultural expectations meant to serve those in power. Feminism has had decades to construct its argument against the so-called oppressive patriarchy. While there are better and worse, more and less just ways to align ourselves with the constraints and requirements of life, this is not primarily a civil rights issue. It's primarily a biological issue. There's a difference between acknowledging constraints and imagining that constraints are the same thing as oppression. If blame needs to be assigned for our limited freedom, perhaps we can blame life itself. In our ideological reaction against gender rigidity, we've tipped into something far more destructive. The denial that the masculine and feminine even exist as real patterns rooted in biology. In some circles, gender is treated as purely a social construction. Terms like masculine and feminine are now considered sometimes as oppressive relics. Many young people are told that gender is infinitely fluid, that biological sex is irrelevant, and that to not identify with your sex in any traditional way is embarrassing, unenlightened, or basic. The word for it is cis, which tends to be derogatory. Meanwhile, those who express discomfort in this cultural free-for-all are shamed or dismissed as bigots, even when their concerns about the well-being of children, the sanity of culture, or the continuity of life itself. We're already seeing consequences. Gender dysphoria has skyrocketed, especially among adolescent girls. Anxiety, depression, and identity confusion are at record highs. But most noteworthy and consequentially, birth rates in many developed countries have dropped below replacement levels. Birth rates aren't falling for a single reason, but several forces stand out, especially the ones that confuse sex and gender role, or sever sex from bonding and reproduction. On the identity side, we've drifted into a kind of gender abstraction that destabilizes the symbolic and biological anchors which once oriented men and women toward each other. Motherhood, fatherhood, and family formation are increasingly framed with suspicion, if not outright characterized as prisons. The biological and cultural patterns that sustained communities for millennia now carry less honor and more doubt. Add to that a widespread deferral of partnership and parenthood, not only because of economics, but because our cultural messaging strongly encourages women to prioritize career, independence, and self-actualization before or instead of family. This isn't about blaming women or anyone for education or work. It's about recognizing how current narratives often pull against biological timelines and pair bonding patterns. At the same time, if a woman says she wants to be a mother and feels most fulfilled in a nurturing role, she's sometimes treated as though she's succumbed to patriarchal programming. If a man wants to protect, build, lead, or provide, he's told his instincts are toxic or outdated. For men, there's been a discouragement about harnessing their aggression toward the pursuit of goals, including the pursuit of a mate. Such traditional male behavior has become associated with the oppressive patriarchy and toxic masculinity. As a man who has followed and participated in the men's movement from its early mythopoetic beginnings in the 90s to its later political expression in the men's rights movement, I have an observation to share. For all of its criticism of feminism, the men's movement has built its case on the same playbook. Yes, both men and women suffer. Much of our suffering is shared, but we also suffer in different ways. These ways are linked at root to our biological roles, not a strategic cultural conspiracy. Like feminism, the men's rights movement often tends to interpret suffering mainly through the lens of unfair cultural expectations. In the name of equality, it rejects any differential expectations for men. Chivalry is what you do if you're brainwashed by the gynocentric culture. No more opening doors, paying for meals, going downstairs with a baseball bat in the middle of the night. No more unequal provisioning of anything. I believe we can and should address the suffering of both women and men and create a culture that attends to both as fairly as we can. But we're not the same. Whether laboring in childbirth or at a stressful or dangerous workplace, life is calling us to make different sacrifices and endure different discomforts for the purpose of perpetuating life, not for maintaining power structures or enforcing outdated norms, but because biology makes unequal demands on us in different ways. We endure this best and derive satisfaction from it when we embrace it as a sacred responsibility rather than trying to shake it off like shackles. And for those who choose to opt out of all of this, there should be accommodation and recognition of other ways that one can contribute to the project of life. But if we don't want to go extinct, we should not dismantle or delegitimize those who do choose that path. Our continued existence beyond our freedom-loving selves depends on them. Alongside gender identity confusion, there are other forces that decouple sex from relationship and reproduction. For instance, reliable contraception and abortion made sex consequence-free in reproductive terms. Digital sexuality, I don't mean fingers, especially pornography, conditions arousal away from real partners and reduces motivation for pair bonding. App-based mating markets amplify abundance and choice in ways that undermine courtship norms and commitment. These shifts don't just change behavior, they rewire expectations about what intimacy is for. Around all of this sit other compounding pressures that impact the birth rate. Housing and childcare costs, career demands, technological distraction, climate and future anxiety, and health or infertility trends. They matter, but they tend to amplify a deeper disconnection already underway, the separation of sexuality, identity, and partnership from life patterns that once made having and rearing children a natural extension of being human. While many of the things I've just mentioned have been embraced as liberation, they've also set the stage for civilization, self-harm, and potentially collapse. But let me be super clear about something. Obviously, not everyone fits neatly into the typical expressions of masculine and feminine. That's always been true. Throughout history, there have been androgynous individuals, cross-gender behaviors, non-conforming temperaments, and same-sex relationships. Some people simply don't identify with their sex patterns, and that's not new. The difference today is that instead of making space for variation while still acknowledging the underlying polarity, we're being asked to deny there ever was a polarity to begin with. And more than that, we're told that it was just made up, a social construction invented by the powerful, whose sole purpose was to limit people's freedom and control them. But accommodating variation does not require denying or erasing the pattern. The fact that some people are left-handed doesn't mean we abandon the concept of handedness altogether. In the same way, making space for atypical expressions shouldn't require the destruction of what is statistically normal, evolutionarily grounded, and socially functional. Yes, I just used that hated word, normal. Most women are naturally inclined hormonally and emotionally toward relational attunement and child-centered behaviors. Most men are naturally inclined toward risk, protection, provision, and spatial problem solving. These aren't just socially imposed cages. They're normal, observable tendencies that have served life for hundreds of thousands of years. Denying them to appear fashionable or inclusive is not progress. It's self-destructive. Calling them normal doesn't have to mean denigrating those who don't follow them. Culture can't evolve if no one ever veers from its norms. At the same time, we need robust expressions of both masculine and feminine modes of being. The masculine on its own, without the balancing influence of the feminine, can become brutal, dominating, or emotionally stunted. This is where the term toxic masculinity is useful. The feminine, on its own, without the boundary and initiative of the masculine, can become avoidant, overprotective, emotionally manipulative and coercive, or sentimental to the point of paralysis. And we can call this toxic femininity. Toxicity happens when one pole eclipses the other, whether in individuals or in entire cultures. A Telos-aligned society doesn't force people into rigid roles, and it doesn't erase the biological foundations of sex. Instead, it recognizes that we need both poles expressed, honored, and integrated. We need women who feel free to be deeply feminine without shame. We need men who feel free to embody the masculine fully without apology. And we also need space for those who land somewhere different, without asking them, or the majority, to pretend that the underlying structure doesn't exist. The point is not to police identity, it's to remember that life itself has strategies, and we ignore them at our peril. The masculine and feminine are not arbitrary. They're evolutionary solutions to the problem of surviving, reproduction, raising children, and forming stable societies. If we dissolve these polarities, we aren't creating freedom, we're dismantling a structure that life depends upon. So here's some difficult questions. How do we protect the integrity of the masculine-feminine polarity while allowing individuals flexibility? How do we stop shaming people for being normal without shaming people who aren't? How do we honor biological design without turning it into a dogma? How do we resist ideologies that want to subvert the entire pattern under the guise of liberation, while also resisting religious orthodoxy that would impose rigid expectations? I don't think we've answered those questions yet as a culture, but I think these are the right questions. But I do know this, whatever shape our future takes, it will not be sustainable if it cuts itself off from life telos, from the parameters, patterns, and needs of life. And life has always expressed itself through polarity, through differences that work in partnership. We don't need to go back in time, but we do need to grow forward without abandoning the foundations that got us here. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.